For most of my life, I've watched nations rise with confidence and fall with disbelief. And what always struck me is how similar their journeys were. Different leaders, different cultures, different eras, yet the same rhythm, the same mistakes, the same predictable arc. When you zoom out far enough, patterns become clearer than events. And when you study the long arc of history, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Are we now living in the final stage of an empire? I didn't realize the importance of this question until I began studying centuries of cycles, not years of headlines, because cycles don't care about opinions. They don't care about politics. They don't care about what people believe should happen. Cycles play out the same way because human behavior plays out the same way. And once you understand that, you start seeing today's world with a completely different level of clarity. Empires don't begin with power. They begin with discipline. They rise on the back of productivity, unity, innovation, and a culture that values effort more than comfort. That's how small nations become global forces. That's how a country with limited resources transforms itself into the center of world power. And that's how every empire begins its upward climb. But success carries its own poison, because the moment a nation becomes comfortable, the seeds of decline quietly begin to grow. The work ethic softens, savings fall, debt rises, politics becomes louder than strategy, entitlement replaces ambition, and slowly, almost invisibly, the cycle shifts from rise to stagnation to decline. Today we are living in a moment that feels familiar, not because we've seen it before, but because history has. A moment where debt has become larger than discipline, where division has become larger than unity, and where external competitors are rising faster than the dominant power can adapt. These pressures don't appear randomly. They appear in the late stage of every major empire. Debt is at unprecedented levels. Money printing has reached a pace that past generations would consider unthinkable. Political polarization has turned governance into conflict, and productivity, the foundation of power, is growing slower than the ambitions the world expects. When you combine high debt, internal conflict, declining competitiveness, and the rise of a powerful rival, that is the exact configuration the final stage of the cycle always begins from. Not collapse, not chaos, but a quiet structural turning point that becomes obvious only when you zoom out far enough. If you're still listening, it means you want to understand where we truly stand. Not emotionally, not politically, but historically. And that understanding is rare, because most people look at the world through the lens of today. Very few look at it through the lens of centuries. In the next section, I'll take you deeper into the specific late-stage symptoms that reveal whether a nation has crossed the line and how far into the final phase it has already traveled. When you study enough empires, one truth becomes clear. Decline is never an accident. It is a sequence, a predictable chain of events that unfold slowly at first, then all at once. And if you look closely, you start recognizing the exact symptoms that appear when an empire enters the final stage of its cycle. The first and most obvious symptom is debt outperforming productivity. Early in a nation's life, borrowing fuels innovation. Late in the cycle, borrowing only delays consequences. Debt becomes a substitute for discipline. Governments stop solving problems and start financing them. And year after year, the gap between what a nation earns and what it spends grows wider. This is the same pattern that weakened the Dutch, the same pattern that drained the British. And today it is the same pattern we are watching unfold again. The second symptom is internal division. Empires fall from the inside long before enemies defeat them from the outside. When the economy slows and inequality rises, nations fragment, groups stop seeing each other as part of the same system. Political identity becomes more important than national identity. People stop listening, stop cooperating, and start fighting for power instead of progress. If you read enough history, you realize something uncomfortable. A divided society is more dangerous than a powerful rival. The third symptom is declining competitiveness. This is the quiet turning point, not visible in headlines, but visible in outcomes. Education weakens, infrastructure ages, innovation slows, the most productive industries leave, and rising nations, more focused, more disciplined, more long-term in their planning, begin to outperform. The same thing happened when Britain fell behind the United States in industry, and today you can see a similar shift as Asian economies surpass older Western structures in manufacturing speed and industrial strategy. The fourth symptom is global overextension. Empires often take on massive responsibilities because they believe they must maintain order. But in the late stage, maintaining that order becomes more expensive than the benefits it provides. Military commitments expand, alliances multiply, conflicts widen, and the empire becomes responsible for a world it no longer has the capacity to manage. This is the moment where power becomes obligation, not advantage. And the fifth symptom, the one almost everyone misses, is the quiet weakening of the currency. A strong currency is the backbone of global power. But when debt surges and money printing accelerates, trust slowly erodes. Other nations begin diversifying. Gold holdings increase. Trade begins flowing through different channels. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't need to. Currency decline is a psychological shift, not an economic one. When these five symptoms appear together, excessive debt, internal conflict, declining competitiveness, global overreach, and a weakening currency, that is the exact configuration of a late-stage empire. If you're still here, I want you to absorb one truth that history repeats again and again. Empires never think they are declining when they actually are. To the people living inside the system, everything feels fixable, everything feels temporary, everything feels political. But when you zoom out far enough, none of it is temporary, it is structural. And now, with those symptoms identified, the real question begins: what happens next? What does the final stretch of the cycle actually look like? How does a world order transform? And what does it mean for the decades ahead? In the next section, you'll see the answer, not from predictions, not from opinions, but from the same long-term cycle that has shaped every empire before us. When an empire enters the final stage of its cycle, the world around it begins to change in ways that feel subtle at first but unmistakable in hindsight. The shift is never sudden. It is a quiet transition, a gradual transfer of power, influence, and momentum from the old center of gravity to the new. And the future begins to unfold long before the people living inside the empire realize what is happening. The end of a cycle does not mean collapse. It means transformation. The Dutch didn't vanish when Britain rose. Britain didn't disappear when America took the lead. Power is not destroyed. It is rearranged. Influence is not lost. It is redistributed. And the world adapts to a new balance that reflects the realities of productivity, innovation, and economic strength. So what does the next stage look like for the current world order? It looks like a slow shift from a single global leader to a system with multiple centers of power. A world where the United States remains influential, but no longer alone at the top. A world where China, Europe, and rising regional powers shape decisions that once depended on a single nation. A world where global leadership becomes a shared responsibility rather than a singular role. In practical terms, this means alliances shifting, trade routes realigning, currencies competing, and technology becoming the new battlefield for power. Empires of the future will not be defined by land or armies, but by data, innovation, and the ability to adapt to rapid change. The nations that lead in AI, biotechnology, energy, and advanced manufacturing will shape the new world order, the same way steam, steel, electricity, and computing shaped the last ones. But here is the truth most people never accept until it is too late. The greatest threat to an empire is not an external rival. It is internal weakness. Debt can be restructured. Geopolitical challenges can be managed. Financial systems can be redesigned. But once a nation loses unity, discipline, and shared purpose, the cycle becomes almost impossible to reverse. And that is the defining question of our time. Can a nation rebuild itself at the peak of its own decline? Can a society rediscover the values that once made it powerful? Can a world order reinvent itself before the cycle completes? History gives us examples of both outcomes. Some empires failed to adapt, and the world changed without them. Others recognized the turning point in time and transformed themselves for the next era. And today, the path forward depends on choices, not fate. If you're still here, it means you understand something essential. We are not witnessing chaos. We are witnessing a cycle, one that has repeated for centuries, one that shapes nations, markets, and global systems. And the people who understand this cycle early are the ones who move through the future with clarity, not fear. The next decades will test the world's assumptions. They will challenge old beliefs. They will force nations to confront truths they've ignored for too long. But transitions are not endings. They are beginnings. The end of one world order is the start of another, and those who see the shift early enough are the ones who shape what comes next. Empires rise, empires fall, and new empires are born from the same forces that ended the old ones. The cycle is not the enemy. The cycle is the map, and understanding that map may be the most important advantage anyone can have in a changing world.